This video is brought to you by Brilliant. The war in Ukraine isn't going well for Russia. Despite sacrificing endless quantities of material and personnel, the Russian army is currently struggling to take the remaining Ukrainian holdouts in Donbass, which the Kremlin claimed as Russian territory back in September via a series of sham referenda. While it might sound far-fetched, foreign policy experts have now started warning that the Russian state as we know it could collapse in the next 10 years, and that the West should do more to prepare for this outcome. So in this video, we're going to look at whether Russia could actually collapse, or whether these warnings are baseless sensationalism, what the collapse of Russia might look like, and what the West should be doing about all of this. Now, the first thing we should say is that we've seen other outlets do pieces on this topic in the past, and we refrained from following suit because, well, we just didn't think that Russia is actually at risk of collapse, and it felt unduly clickbaity to do a video on something we didn't think could happen. However, over the last few weeks, more and more analysts have started treating it as a real possibility, and warning that the West should at least make some preliminary preparations. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor under both Nixon and Ford, and the standard-bearer for modern realism in international relations, wrote a piece in The Spectator last month, warning that, quote, the dissolution of Russia could turn its territory into a contested vacuum, and that this wouldn't be good for European or global stability. Then, this week, a survey by the Atlantic Council of 167 foreign policy experts found that an astonishing 46% thought that Russia's failure or breakup could happen in the next 10 years. More than a fifth considered Russia the most likely country to become a failed state within the next 10 years, more than twice the percentage for second-placed Afghanistan. Even Putin himself seems worried about it. In his 2023 New Year's address, he described the war in Ukraine as a potential threat to Russia's independence, something he's not said before.
Пусть эти сердечные слова и благородные чувства придадут всем нам как можно больше душевных сил, уверенности, что вместе мы преодолеем все трудности и сохраним нашу страну великой и независимой.
So, is Russia really at risk of collapse? Or is this just American foreign policy hawks seeing what they want to see? Well, there are reasons to be skeptical. For starters, Russia just doesn't look like a state that's about to collapse. While public support for the special military operation is waning, Putin is personally very popular in Russia, and the Russian state is functioning well. According to the latest Levada polling for November, 81% of Russians approve of Putin, while just 17% disapprove. On top of that, Putin has successfully purged all his political opponents, which means there's not really any faction vying to replace him. Similarly, while the Russian economy has entered recession, it's milder than most analysts expected when the West first announced its unprecedented sanctions early last year. And it's not the sort of thing that would usually threaten the functioning of a state. Anyway, you get the idea. Russia looks politically and economically stable, which should make us wary of predictions of its imminent collapse. Nonetheless, those analysts warning of Russia's collapse will point to the fact that, even if Russia's state looks stable at the moment, the trajectory over the next 10 years or so doesn't look good. While Russia's economy has so far outperformed expectations, largely thanks to higher than average hydrocarbon revenues and Russian industry's ability to use pre-existing stockpiles to blunt the effect of import sanctions, the medium and long-term prognoses don't look good. In the medium term, falling oil and gas prices combined with the success of the G7's price cap will mean reduced hydrocarbon revenues, and dwindling stockpiles will limit Russia's industrial capacity. In the long term, demographic factors, a lack of international investment, and the staggering loss of human and intellectual capital incurred by Putin's invasion will conspire to limit Russia's economic growth. If Russia's economy stagnates, this will put pressure on Putin, especially given that much of Putin's popularity depends on his image as a talented technocrat who can guarantee economic growth. Those analysts warning of Russia's collapse will also point to the fact that, even if a country looks stable, things can deteriorate surprisingly quickly. Just look at the Soviet Union, for example. Very few people predicted its collapse, and as late as March 1991, a 76% majority of Soviet citizens voted in a referendum to retain their country, including majorities of over 70% in every individual SSR. Similarly, while Putin might have successfully purged his political opponents, it only took a coup attempt, not even a successful coup, to bring down the Soviet Union. So, if the Russian state were to collapse, what would it look like? Well, honestly, no one knows, but there are basically two big questions. First, would it be violent? And second, would it lead to secessionist movements? Let's start with the first question. Would the collapse of Russia be violent? Well, the answer here is probably yes. State collapses are usually violent, and even though the collapse of the Soviet Union was relatively peaceful, there's an argument that the war in Ukraine is, in a sense, delayed violence from that historical event. Putin, the Kremlin, and a significant faction of the Russian public apparently never accepted Ukraine's secession or its existence as an independent state, and Putin's invasion is at least partly motivated by this idea. As for the second question, it's even harder to say. It probably depends on the events leading up to Russia's collapse. If the Kremlin continue to rely disproportionately on Russia's ethnic minorities and force its non-Russian regions to take the economic strain of the coming economic slowdown, then we could well see demands for greater self-rule from Russia's ethnic republics, including Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Chechnya, Dagestan and Sakha. All in all, it looks like the collapse of the Russian state would probably be a messy, violent affair. This leads us on to the final bit of this video. What should the West do about all this? Is the collapse of Russia something the West should be aiming for or trying to avoid? There are basically two schools of thought here. One is what we might call the Kissinger school of thought, which says that, given the huge number of people and nuclear weapons involved, the collapse of the Russian state would just be unpalatably chaotic, and so the West should try to avoid it. Most Western European leaders seem to abide by this school of thought. This is presumably what Macron is thinking when he suggests the West provide security guarantees or an off-ramp for Putin. The second is what we might call the Ukrainian school of thought. The Ukrainians disagree with the Kissinger-Macron position and instead argue that, in fact, the best way to guarantee European security in the long term is to orchestrate the collapse of Russia, which they consider the main aggressor on the European continent and the threat to European peace. Now, heading into 2023, everyone's hoping that issues like this will resolve. But if world leaders are anything like us, resolutions and plans for the new year are already out the window. If you do want to improve yourself though, maybe pick up a new resolution and sign up to Brilliant, the STEM learning platform which helps you with exciting new science and maths topics through engaging and interactive experiences. Their courses, including ones co-designed by YouTubers including Kurzgesagt and fellow Nebula creator Real Engineering, bring the topics to life and let you learn by doing, not just sitting in a class like at school. That means that all kinds of topics which previously seemed a little too complex might suddenly be in your grasp. That's things like algebra, geometry, the physics of every day, or even gravitational physics. So up your game in STEM in 2023 to improve your understanding of the world, boost your career, help at school or university, or even just for the sake of lifelong learning. Plus, the first 200 people to sign up using our code get 20% off an annual premium subscription, which is probably a bigger win than most people's 2023 resolutions have been. Anyway, thanks for your support.